Good evening and welcome to the Exclusion of Women, a night with Maggie Anton. I'm WRJ Pacific District Program Committee Chair, Wendy Black. Some 30 years ago, Maggie decided to take a woman's Talmud class at Hebrew Union College. It was taught by Professor Rachel Adler, one of the first theologians to inject feminist perspectives into Jewish texts. It changed her life. Maggie became a Talmudic scholar and penned several award-winning books on Jewish women's historical fiction, a trilogy, Rashi's Daughters, and Rav Hizda's Daughter, Apprentice, and its sequel, Enchantress. She also won a Gold Ben Franklin Award for the nonfiction book, 50 Shades of Talmud, What the First Rabbis Had to Say About You Know What. Love that title. Maggie's latest book is The Choice, a novel of love, faith, and the Talmud. The Choice will be available on May 17th. You can pre-order on PayHip for instant download as an ebook or purchase the hardcover. Please write your questions for Maggie in the chat and we'll read them when she is done with her presentation. And now we're proud to present Maggie Anton.
Hello, here I am. And I'm going to make one, I'm not going to call it a small correction, but even though my pub date is May 17th, a truckload of books showed up at my house yesterday. So I have plenty of copies of the print book, and you can go on PayHip, actually just log onto my website and hit the buy the ebook now, and it will be in your books collection instantaneously. So we don't tell Amazon about this, but we can arrange, although you guys are like all over the Pacific region, so probably I'm not going to send books to each person's house. But if you want me to speak at your synagogue at some point in the Pacific, that can be arranged. I'm organizing a book tour for the Bay Area, Northern California in October, and I'll be driving around there. And of course, I live in LA, so I can easily go do Southern California sisterhood and synagogue groups. All right, thank you for inviting me to do this. It's kind of exciting because I haven't done a book tour in many years. So I'm kind of warming up on you guys. But I want to start even earlier in my life than Rachel's Talmud class, because I never thought that I would be an author. I never imagined I would be an author. I have a degree in chemistry from UCLA. I worked for like almost 40 years in clinical laboratories doing lab tests, most of them in Kaiser Permanente Central Laboratory. And what got me interested in Talmud, amazingly, was that in the late 1960s, when I was in college, I read Chaim Potak's duology. You've all heard of trilogy, which is 3 books, but duology is 2-book series. And I read The Chosen and The Promise, and I was that was the first I ever heard of Talmud. Even though I didn't go to religious school. I grew up in a secular socialist household, and I went to Kindershul, put on by the Workman's Circle people. And believe me, we certainly didn't ever mention anything about Talmud. And actually at my Reform Shul in the 1970s, there wasn't much Talmud either. So, but I knew from Talmud that there was such a thing from Potak's works, and I knew that women didn't, or perhaps we could say couldn't, whether we want to say discouraged, prevented, forbidden. Women didn't study Talmud, which is pretty much why I signed up for Rachel Adler's class. All you have to do is forbid something and it immediately becomes attractive. So I signed up for her class, where now I really learned about Talmud. I mean, I thought I knew about Talmud, right? I'd read Chaim Potak's books, but no, this was real Talmud, actual sugiot. And we were focused on women. And of course, Rashi's on every page, almost every line, he's explaining stuff. And Rachel points out that Rashi has daughters reputed to be learned, reputed to wear tefillin. And having no idea what I was getting into, I thought, I'm going to see if those legends are true. They were. And I did a whole lot of research, so much, in fact, that I ended up being able to write 3 novels about the family and the community that not only, okay, I wrote the book I wanted to read, but it turned out there was like a whole lot of other people, mostly Jewish women, who also wanted to read that. So we're going to fast forward. I'm coming to the end of the first of Rashi's Daughters, the third book, and I'm now doing book tours and doing all the stuff that I ever imagined I would be doing. And when I would speak, like maybe a scholar weekend, I didn't want to stay in a hotel. It's kind of lonely, and it would cost the synagogue that invited me a lot of money. So I used to like to stay in people's houses. And of course, typical Jewish person who would have a scholar stay there, they're going to have lots and lots of Jewish books. And indeed, in the bedroom that I stayed were walls of Jewish books. And I saw Potak's originals there, The Promise and The Chosen. And I thought, oh, wow, I haven't, that was like from 30 something years ago, maybe more like 40 years ago. And I thought, okay, I'm going to read those. I don't want to start reading something new that if I don't finish it by the time to leave, then I won't finish it. But I thought this one, I've read it before. Let's just see how it is. And to my astonishment, well, not my astonishment, but anyway, but at this point, I'm a feminist. And I really noticed the absence of women. The two heroes, there's the Hasidic one and what we would call modern Orthodox, but of course back then it was just Orthodox. It wasn't, nobody called it modern Orthodox. But anyway, the Orthodox one, regular Orthodox, I'll call him, has no mother. Apparently she died when he was young, but we know nothing about her. She doesn't have a name. He never says Kaddish for her. There's no pictures of her, no stories of her. It was not immaculate, conception from the other direction. He had a mother missing in action. The Hasidic one, he has a mother, but we don't hardly ever see her. She doesn't have a name either. We don't know anything about her. And considering that in the Hasidic world, men and women are so separated, the Rebbetzin is a very powerful figure. She's second only to the Rebbe because all the women come to her and she has to, help their problems, help solve their problems anyway. So I noticed that, and it really kind of bothered me that all these women were missing. And then I read the only book, Davita's Harp, the only book that Potak wrote with a female protagonist. And actually it wasn't a big favorite of reviewers. They didn't think he did such a good job writing female protagonists. So if he had intended a sequel, he never wrote it, but he never wrote any more books with her in it. And I read that book, and I get to like the final quarter of the book, or towards the ending of the book. She's in grade school, so it's taking place earlier in time than The Chosen and The Promise. And who is it? One of her grade school classmates, but the hero, the protagonist, the Orthodox one from The Chosen, from The Promise. I was like, what is he doing here? This book was written 30 years later. Why did Potak stick him in there? And to me, it looked like this is a Chekhov's gun. And for those of you not familiar with the term, Chekhov taught that if a playwright is going to have a gun appear in the first chapter, in the first act, or if he's writing a book in the first chapter, it better go off by the end of the play, or the end, it should get fired by the end of the book. And so I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, well, wait a second. Obviously, he intended for the heroine, Davita's of Davita's Harp, and the hero of The Chosen to get together. Why else would he stick them in there? But whatever happened, Potak died in 2002, and the gun was never fired. So the way I avoid worrying about, or stop worrying about things that would normally keep me up at 4 o'clock in the morning, when I can't do anything about whatever it is that's bothering me, is I think about books that I've read. I have questions about them. I wonder what the characters are doing outside of the book. When I'm a voracious reader of fiction, or at least I was, and I always considered these characters had larger lives than what the author told us. And so I started imagining, okay, if I was going to put these characters together, how would I do it? What would I say? And I thought, well, I wouldn't just put them together. I would bring in those missing women, their mothers, the Hasidic guy's mother. I would bring him in too. And the more I thought about it, the various scenes started occurring to me. And what could I say? The characters were stuck in my head and they refused to leave. Even though Penguin wanted me to write another series, I wrote the one Rav Hizda, Apprentice and Enchantress. That took me up to 2014. And, then I decided to write 50 Shades of Talmud just for the fun of it. It wouldn't take too long. And still, those characters from Potok's works were refusing to leave my head. And I thought, okay, that's it. I'm going to write this. Who knows if it could ever get published, whether the Potoks will authorize it or not. I didn't worry about that. I just needed to get this out. That's what happens sometimes when you're a novelist. At least if you write it down, then the characters won't haunt you anymore. So I started to do some research about this time period, well, the two time periods. I knew, okay, if I'm going to write a story about that is going to have these two characters get together, I have to set it when they're young adults, when it's later than when the promise ended. And I thought about the middle 1950s. I don't want them to be so old that people are going to not be able to see them as a romantic couple. But on the other hand, I wanted to get well past the end of the other books. And I started doing research about Brooklyn, about New York City in the mid 1950s. And I found out that actually, wow, there's a lot of interesting things that are happening here. The polio vaccine. If you're my age, and I'm 72, when I started kindergarten, we lined up and got the polio vaccine. And this is also the time when the Dead Sea Scrolls are being discovered and made a lot of press. This was the War of the Suez Canal. This is when Stalin dies. This is when the House of Un-American Activities Committee is investigating communists under every rock. And any of you who read Davita's Harp know that her parents were communists and got into a lot of trouble with this. So, and of course, the books, the first two Potok books, there was baseball. And it just so happened that in 1955, okay, most years the Brooklyn Dodgers played the New York Yankees in the World Series and lost. But in 1955, the one time Brooklyn beat the Yankees, it took them 7 games to do it. And there was a fabulous play that, not like Chekhov's play, but a baseball play that is still world famous, that Brooklyn was able to win in the last inning of the 7th game. And this being, quote, modern times now, that was on television. Like you can go see the video on YouTube. I actually put it on my website because I used it as a scene. It was such an exciting piece of baseball. I thought, I got to put my characters there. That's one of the things when you're writing, okay, these are not historical figures. I don't have to worry about, did they really do this or did they really not do this? What I mainly have to make sure that I'm accurate and I have them going to the World Series and seeing the Dodgers and the Yankees in a year in which that actually happened. But so I started weaving in all of these historical things going on in the mid 1950s. But I also had to do research because I wanted to include the older women, the Rebbitzins' backstory, my hero's nameless mother's backstory. So now I'm looking at, okay, 1920s New York and maybe the late 1910s in New York. And compared to the research I had to do on the Rashi's daughters and Rav Hizda's daughters, where, we're talking things happened 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago, when there isn't all that much resources. Excuse me. The New York Times, every single issue going back to the 1880s. They've digitalized it. It's online, searchable. I could read every single New York Times article and find out what was going on back then. And I made two very surprising discoveries that, of course, I put into the book. The first was, I'm assuming that everybody here is familiar with the OU hechsher, that you find the circle and a U inside it on your foodstuffs. That means that it's kosher, and it will either have a D on it saying that it's kosher dairy, or a P for parv. They don't certify milk. They don't certify meat. That's different. But in terms of something you could buy at Trader Joe's or in your grocery store, I mean, the lactate milk that I get from Ralph's has got the OUD on it. And how that came about, we just all kind of take it for granted that there it is. And I have plenty of vegetarian friends who are not Jewish who look for the OU hechsher, because when they see that OU and a D, they know there's no meat in there. And they can buy it with the assurance that they won't be inadvertently eating meat. Well, that OU hechsher came about in the mid-1920s when a group of Orthodox women's, like sisterhoods, got very frustrated over the fact that their kids were constantly bugging them about, they wanted to eat food that their friends ate, but the mothers didn't feel, how do I know this is kosher? I don't want you to eat unkosher food. But there wasn't really hechshers back in the 1910s, in the 1920s. There were rabbis who certified butchers, but these rabbis, many of them were from the old country, shall we say, and they come over to America and they don't have a job there. It's not like the olden days where their community supported them. They come to America, they don't speak English, they only speak Yiddish, they mostly know Talmud. They can't give a sermon in an Orthodox synagogue to save their soul. They're looking for something they can do to earn some money, earn a living. And they went out and they certified various Jewish establishments, or restaurants, or butcher stores, or things like that as kosher. And maybe they were, and maybe they weren't. But the Orthodox women, and there were plenty of scandals, even, let's face it, even today in Los Angeles, we recently had a so-called kosher butcher who was buying regular meat and calling it kosher, and I don't know who, but somebody caught him. So it still happens that we have unscrupulous or dishonest. So the Orthodox women who are, let's say, more modern in the 1910s or 1920s, they didn't trust these guys. And somehow they got the idea, a group of them, to go to major manufacturers. We're talking Heinz, where, we're not just talking, the guys who make matzah, Manischewitz, but they went to really some of the top level. They went to Carvel Ice Cream. Be to their advantage if they allowed supervision and got this label that would go on their food. And it's going to be that difficult to certify them kosher dairy or kosher parv. And it came about, and pretty soon, you can see, I think there's thousands, if not millions, of food products now that have the OU label on them. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. I never had, who knew that women managed to do this? And Orthodox women naturally would be the ones. And that's when I thought, oh, we don't know who the names are of these women who did this. That's what my hero's mom is going to be involved in. She's going to be one of those women. So I get to include that history and have some scenes of how she does it. And here's the thing about a historical novel. As long as nobody can prove that what I wrote is wrong, as long as what I write could have happened, might have happened, as long as I have some kind of evidence for it, then I'm good. And believe me, if anybody finds out who really those women were, I would love to know. So that gave the the Orthodox guy's mother a bit of a backstory. I stuck her in Philadelphia, and gave her more story from back then and how they met. And then I had to also come up with a story for the Rebbitzin, how she ended up marrying this old Rebbe who was much older than her. Came up with that as well. And I came up with more backstory on how my hero gets in touch with he finally finds out who his mother is, and he meets his family from Philadelphia. We can have some very emotional family stories here going on, as he is no longer in a small family that's just him and his father. So that was Philadelphia has a lot of interesting Jewish history as well, more than New York. I mean, as much as New York. So that's, I'm like putting together a piece, a big puzzle, and I have all these pieces that I have to put together and make them fit. I have to create puzzle pieces when there's a blank space of how do I connect all these plots. So I'm using Potak's books. I'm inspired by them as giving me the backdrop for the puzzle, or the outline of the puzzle. And I have to fill in the middle, but I have to make it fit. So one of the things that I decided, because there was so much interesting stuff happening in Israel in the beginning of the 1950s, and Israel's only been a state for a few years at that point. So there was all kinds of stuff going on there. And I remembered that my heroine, her aunt, had been a missionary nurse. She was a nurse in all kinds of battle zones. And I thought, well, of course, when World War II happens, she's going to get drafted, or she will be encouraged to volunteer. They needed a lot of nurses in World War II, and she's an experienced one. I made her like a captain or whatever it would be. And she thought, okay, she's a nurse in Europe. Well, when the war's over, she's naturally going to be working in the displaced persons camps. She did all these other kinds of nursing in war zones. And being a pious Christian, she's certainly going to she's going to jump at the opportunity to continue to do her nursing in the new state of Israel. So that was a lot more interesting research as well about how did they take care of all the immigrants that are coming from the Mizrahi, from Iraq, Iran, Yemen, all those people who were still living kind of like in the 12th century, and now they're in modern Tel Aviv. And I have my heroine go there during the summer, her summer vacations from college, to help her aunt with dealing with the women who refuse to see men doctors. So I more and more filling out the puzzle. But that's getting the basic plot in place, and backstories on the characters that didn't have any before. But I had also another purpose. All of my books have contained Talmud, and part of my goal in all of them is that my readers will learn some Talmud by reading them. In Rashi's Daughters, you're going to hear Rashi teach his children, and you're going to learn too. But this was my opportunity to now take all these interesting, or we'll call it interesting, pieces of Talmud dealing with women, and put them in one book in some kind of order that they're actually going to teach, from the easiest to the next easiest, to finally getting to the really tough stuff towards the end. Because my character, the whole point, you hear the title, Love, Faith, and Talmud. My book's a romance. I like to read romances. I like happy endings. And the way that my hero and heroine come to fall in love with each other, besides a classic girl meets boy, girl gets boy, girl loses boy, girl gets boy, back and forth until you get to the happy ending at the end. Well, one of the things when they are in grade school together, she wants to go and study Talmud with the boys and not just study Psalms and Proverbs with the girls. And the teacher said, no, you can't. Girls can't study Talmud. You have to stay in here. And so that immediately, right? As soon as something's forbidden, you becomes attractive. What does OI? No, it's OU. Oh, thank you very much, Wendy. We should have a picture of what, well, listen, any one of you can go to your refrigerator and look at a carton of milk and you'll see the OU picture on it, I'm sure, as well as your other kinds of things. So anyway, she is a journalist. Podhoc had her going to journalism school, so that was a no-brainer. And our hero, who is now teaching at the yeshiva, that the university that he used to be a student at, and he's teaching the Talmud criticism, which he got in trouble with in the other books. Well, now he has a PhD, and the newspaper she works for it was actually a real one, the Daily Freiheit. It was a Yiddish communist newspaper. My grandmother read it. And so I stick my hero in, okay, she's going to work for them. And she gets the assignment to go interview him, which she does. They reconnect, sparks fly. And she, besides just the interview, she says, can you teach me some Talmud so I can explain to my readers who are going to read this article what exactly that it is you do? And there is the first choice of the many choices that happen to my characters during this book. Is he knows it's forbidden to teach women Talmud. It's forbidden for women to study Talmud, but he can't resist. And he figures he can do it in private. And he certainly wants to reconnect with her. He hasn't seen her in 11 years, and she's now a very attractive woman of 25. He's pretty attractive too. If you've seen the covers of the book, you can see what they look like. And so he has a kind of argument with himself whether and finally he manages to convince himself that he will teach her maybe for 6 weeks, for 2 months. They're coming up on Passover. He'll teach her the sections of Talmud about Pesach, and which actually are quite simple, and they have to do with the Seder that everybody's familiar with anyway. And so he figures he'll just teach her for that amount of time. What he does, and then they can go their ways. So that's the first piece of Talmud that my readers are introduced to, and learn about why we have the 4 cups of wine, and why do we recline with them, and why women are obligated to observe the mitzvot of Passover, even though there's part of the Mishnah says that women are exempt from mitzvot, from observing mitzvot, fulfilling mitzvot that take place at certain times. Those of you who've spent a lot of times in the Jewish world, especially if you're anywhere near my age, you know that for a long time, women didn't wear talis. They didn't wear tzitzit. They certainly didn't wear tefillin. Women didn't study Talmud, that's for sure. But there were also other things that men did that women didn't do. Aliyot at the Torah, reading Torah. And I was looking into, all my years of studying is, why don't women do those? Why? Is it just custom? Is it they're forbidden? Actually, does the Talmud say something that they don't do it? Which it does. And so I investigate those, and I have them start to study those sections of Talmud. And by the way, women are obligated, even though the Mishnah says women don't do the mitzvot that have to be done at a certain time, which you'd think would certainly exclude Passover. But we have no explanation why that even came about, why there are these time-bound positive mitzvot that women are exempt from. It just suddenly says women are exempt from these mitzvot that are done at a certain time. They don't even tell you which ones they are. And if you look at all the mitzvot which actually are done at a certain time, women have to do more of them than the number they're exempt from. But anyway, we get into that, gives you just an example of the kind of arguments and discussions that my 2 main characters have. And anybody who's read romance novels know that the characters have to fight with each other a lot over something. There has to be conflicts before they can kiss and make up. Not that my characters get to kiss when they make up. So I take you through various sections of Talmud and get up to finally towards the end, as my characters are preparing to get married, the big disadvantages that Jewish law has subjected women to. As Reformed women, we've kind of escaped most of this, although we may have friends and relatives who struggle with the fact that in the Orthodox world, a woman cannot divorce her husband. Only he can divorce her. And you may have heard of the women aguna who are chained because their husbands refuse to give them a divorce, or because the husband has deserted the family and cannot be found, and or died, but there's no witnesses, there's no body. Their boat sank or something, so it's assumed that they're dead. And today, even this is a big problem in Israel and in the Orthodox world here. Believe me, look at that in the New York Times, you'll see all these kinds of stories about it. So I also have a subplot with the other two characters that Potok inspired. The Hasidic one, who marries it's questionable whether she's actually Orthodox or conservative. And I've done enough research into the Hasidic world to know that a non-Hasidic woman who marries certainly it'd be highly unlikely that that match would even happen. I mean, you've probably all seen Shtisel or Unorthodox or any of those nice, delightful Netflix shows. But I knew that match is going to have so much problem. She's never going to be accepted by his community, and he may not care, but she certainly will. So I had to deal with them and their problems and how they overcome them. So all kinds of plot points in there. How long am I supposed to speak? When does someone pull the curtain or
how about 5 more minutes?
5 more minutes. Okay, let's get down to.
Sound good. 5 more minutes. Thank you.
Yes. So the one thing that I did is change everybody's names. If you've read Potok's books, you are not going to recognize the names of my characters. They may sound a little bit like his, but when you're combining several books by the same author, you end up with 4 Davids and 3 Hannahs and Sarahs. It just makes it really hard for readers to do that. So I said, okay, fine, I'm just going to change everybody's name. And I'll make it sound kind of like the original character. And honestly, I suspect at this point, a whole lot of my potential readers have never read Potok's book. Certainly my children have not. So I changed all the names. And then what I did was try and make the plot so it didn't totally contradict the things that his characters did, but expand into areas that he left unaddressed, like the women's lives before. So let's see, do we have any questions? You've only got a few minutes, or I got a few minutes before questions. So, and it's like, not only do I have a happy ending, I want to ask, okay, I'm assuming I see some gray-haired ladies out there besides me that might be familiar with Potok's works.
Yes.
And a lot of people really, really disliked the Hasidic Rebbe, the one who raised his son in silence, and it was very traumatic for the boy, and that's why he decides to be a psychologist so he can help other children who have suffered other kinds of problems with their families. And so I personally dislike this guy too, and I thought, I can't imagine what it must be like for his wife, the Rebbetzin, who has to see her son suffer in silence, and she cannot even comfort him. So I decided, this is the advantage of writing the book you want to read, I gave the Rebbe a stroke and nobody can understand what he says. And his wife has to pretty much be the power behind the throne. And eventually I knocked him off entirely. So that gave me great satisfaction. There's
Maggie, we've got
characters you don't like.
a question from Eve Panouche, I hope. Do we need to read Potok's books before reading your book?
Absolutely not. They are completely self-contained. I don't expect that people will read them. I mean, maybe they might if they're my age. What might happen is that people who have not read Potok's books might be enticed to read them or curious to read them, but absolutely you don't need to read them. And if you're a feminist, they will probably irritate you to read these books where the women just don't even have no names and have no places. And honestly, in a lot of the research that I did, as I'm looking about books about the Orthodox in New York, there were books that never mentioned women at all. They didn't talk about the Beit Yaakov schools. They didn't mention kashrut. It was all about yeshivas and men's organizations and what men did. And that just shows you what things were like, that books about Orthodoxy in New York, it's all about men.
Maggie, what surprised you most in your study of Talmud?
Oh, my study of Talmud. Actually, what surprised, oh boy, I was standing on one foot. What actually surprised me, and this is actually where 50 Shades of Talmud came from, is that the Talmudic rabbis were surprisingly progressive when it came to attitudes about sex. Believe me, nobody would mistake the rules that the original Talmudic rabbis came up with Catholicism. I mean, the first, be fruitful and multiply is the first mitzvah for Jews. So anyway, you can get 50 Shades of Talmud. And by the way, I now know that like half of my readers, half of the people who buy my books are buying the ebooks now. 50% of my sales are ebooks. And whether it's because they have no room on their shelves for any more print books, or one woman said, this way my husband doesn't get to see all the books that I'm buying because he doesn't see any books. And you get yourself an e-reader of some sort. So both The Choice and 50 Shades of Talmud are available as ebooks. And from a company, PayHip, I should put this into the chat, where there's no middleman. The money goes straight to me. So I don't have to deal with who that.
Maggie, now that there are more women studying Talmud.
Oh, what happened in the chat?
There you go. Now that more women are studying Talmud, can you comment on what you see as any future systemic exclusion of women from some Orthodox practices?
Okay, wait, I'm putting this there. You go to that website and
right. It's right on there.
Actually, I really am. I never would imagine I would see Orthodox women rabbis in my lifetime. So in terms of speculating what is going to happen in the future, the one thing that the Talmud is now wide open for women to study. There's plenty of yeshivas for women, and there's really good translations now. So there's no reason why you don't have to know Aramaic, and you don't actually need to have a great Talmud Chacham to teach you. I actually do my Talmud study online through the conservative movements, Mishnah Yomit and Daf Shvivi. They send you something in your email every day, and I got behind a bit writing this book. But it's very easy to study Talmud online, and there's great opportunities for it, and women too. What do they say? If you're when you're on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Well, when you're studying Talmud on the internet, nobody knows you're a woman, or whatever else I'm now distracted by reading about the bad. So I'll have to sign up for that too.
And you said you were writing a book about the Ukraine too, right?
Well, I'm starting to research it. I did not have any idea what I was going to do next. I'm 72 and I have 6 grandchildren that I would like to spend more time with before they don't want to spend any time with me anyway. And I hadn't really been thinking of another book that I would write. But then this disaster in Ukraine burst onto the news, and I'm seeing the name HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, bandied around a lot as they're helping the immigrants. And I remember, well, gee, my parents' families came from Ukraine, and HIAS helped them get out in the big pogroms that were from 1918 to 1921, which kind of pre-staged the Holocaust. And so I started thinking, gee, I could write a story based on how my family got out of there. They had quite some interesting stuff. I had previously interviewed some of my elderly relatives when I had the genealogy bug way back in the 1980s. You remember Roots? And I knew that my father had 3 sisters who led very different lives, even though they came over around the same time. One of them went to Palestine for many years. She was there when the state of Israel first started going in the 1920s, and then came back again in the 1940s. So I have her story. I have all different, it's like talking to your old great aunts and uncles, plus the story of how it was to live in Ukraine in the shtetls, and how long it took, how difficult it was to leave and what those pogroms were actually like. And now all of a sudden it's like history of Ukraine and Jews in Israel is all over the place. The experts are talking about it. I've read some books about it. So that's what I'm researching. But mostly at this point, I'm still doing promotion for the choice. What I'm actually doing is I've got to talk to my cousins who are older even than me, so they can tell me what their parents, the stories they heard before those stories are gone. So that's, who knows when it'll happen, if it'll happen a lot. There's all kinds of things that may stop me, but at least I'm starting to do the research. I'm looking to see who are the experts in the field so I could read their books, who else has written novels or books about this, so I can see what they said. So but of course I'm going to focus on my father's 3 sisters who have very different stories. And as always, look at the, women's lives then. So I'm looking at my notes to see what else I had.
Starting to read your book, the first thing I thought of was the movie Yentl. Do you see that any different? I assume you saw it because you're laughing.
Yes.
Do you see it any differently before you started writing this book and then when you finished writing the book?
Well, I saw Yentl like a zillion years ago. I mean, when it first came out, I think I was doing Rashi's Daughters at the time, which I thought was actually much more applicable because Yentl's father teaches her and Rashi teaches his daughters. I'm sitting here staring at my computer and wondering if I should just Google when the heck Yentl movie came out. Anybody else want to quick look that up? But actually I read Yentl long before, so I already knew this story, and I didn't want, Rashi's daughters were real people, so I couldn't quite go as far as Yentl did. But apparently Yentl wasn't the only one. Women disguise themselves as men in many opportunities and places, and in order to take advantage of living a man's life. I mean, Mulan is the movie. Let's see, Yentl 1983. Okay, so definitely that would have been that would be over 20 years before Rashi's Daughters came out. So I'm sure that I knew that I had seen it, but I doubt that it influenced me. Isn't it amazing the things you can find on the internet? Oh, here is another, one of the most amazing things that I found in my research that it still boggles my mind, is one of the conflicts that I gave my main characters is what to do about using the mikveh. The Orthodox hero, he's teaching at a yeshiva university, and he's in a cloistered world. He doesn't have a mother, he doesn't have sisters, he's interacting with men all the time only, and all he knows about mikveh is what he's learned in becoming a rabbi and studying Talmud. But back in real life in New York, almost no women at all were going to mikvahs except the very Hasidic ones who went to their own specialized mikvahs for their community. Two things had stopped women from going to mikvot. The first being that the women from the old country, when they came over, they were young. Very often they weren't married yet, they were single, their mothers were stuck back in Ukraine or wherever, Poland or wherever they were. So there was I hate to use the word the divorce, but there was a big gap, so that these young women did not get the education from their mothers about what happens when you're about to get married and what the woman's responsibilities are. If they got married by a rabbi, they would get like a mikveh manual. I have a collection of them. They're pathetic. They're not going to make anybody want to use a mikveh, that's for sure. And when a woman went to the mikveh, what she found was mikvahs that were like 20, 30 years old, maybe, never cleaned. They were in the basements of a building, or sometimes underneath the basements of somebody's house. The water came in from a cistern or was collected from rainwater on the ceiling, on the roof, and came down into there. But I know because the New York City in 1910s, it was the health department got wind of these things. They now hear that there's these mikvahs, and they go and inspect them, and the reports would curl your hair if your hair wasn't curly already. I mean, just awful. And the more modern women who now have indoor plumbing and have never been taught about these or why they're supposed to use them or what's the purpose, they're saying, I'm not going in there. Are you kidding? The New York City Health Department, when they made up rules for building mikvahs, they grandfathered in the old ones. So nobody touched those or did anything with them. But the new ones had to be cleaned once a month. Can you imagine only having to be cleaned once a month, and men and women are both using them? And then there's the other ones that are never cleaned. They just get new water added to them. And at the same time, certainly in Brooklyn, there were lots and lots of Turkish baths and Russian baths and what my father would have called the schwitz, where women's hours were in the evening and the men's were in the afternoon, and women, anyway, it's pretty clear. Women said, well, I see this nice Turkish bath and it's warm and they have, dressing rooms, and if I got to immerse someplace, I'll immerse there. Believe me, if you would immerse in those original mikvaot, you would come home and take a bath or shower anyway. So the women are coming home and they see, hey, I got this nice bathtub in here. What do I need to go to these filthy other places where I just have to come home and wash? And believe me, the men didn't have a clue what the women were doing or not doing. This was the point where they got to find out, well, if you're, 2 weeks out of the year, 2 weeks out of the month, you can't sleep with your wife. You can't even touch your wife. You have to wait till she goes to the mikveh. And apparently lots of men said, no way, that's not happening. And I know that women were not going to the mikveh because somebody did a study and interviewed a lot of Orthodox women, but mainly I know because one of these mikveh manuals from the late 50s, published in 1960, gives a list of all the Orthodox approved mikvahs in the country, so that if a woman's traveling, when she needs to use one, she can find one. There are only 3 in Manhattan. You know how many millions of Jews there were in Manhattan? And they only have 3 mikvahs? So that was going to be the big conflict between my hero and heroine. She grew up in this communist socialist household. She knows nothing of mikvahs, not until they're about to get married, and the rabbi gives her the booklet, and she's like, what? And she learns what she needs, what she learns about it from, she's become friends with the wife of the Hasidic one. And the wife of the Hasidic one hates it. She hates going to the Hasidic mikvahs. They're even less sanitary than maybe the regular Orthodox mikvahs. Reform and conservative women absolutely were not going anywhere near these. Although, of course, you could immerse in the ocean or the lake or something. But New York City, it's cold a lot. You wouldn't be doing that in most of the year. So anyway, exploring the history of how we got modern mikvot was something fascinating to me, and the fact that we have reevaluated and mikveh use has, I won't say skyrocketed, but certainly become much more popular. And it's not just an Orthodox thing now. I know women who have been to the mikveh after a hysterectomy, after having some kind of cancer surgery, for all kinds of reasons where they want to feel reborn or they have a new life starting.
Well, thank you, Maggie, for spending time with us. Again, she's available if you'd like her to speak at your women's group or congregation. I'd also like to thank our tech, Shari Carruthers, and you for spending the
Yay.
evening with us. Before we say goodnight, we want to inform you of this very special event on Wednesday, June 1st at 7 o'clock Pacific. Despite the fact that its president is Jewish, Ukraine has a long and complex relationship with Jews who live there. We'll examine that history with Dr. Stephen Windmuller, political scientist and professor emeritus at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, when he addresses the backstory, Ukraine, Israel, and world Jewry. We're posting the registration link. It also will be available on Yammer and Highlight. Thank you for joining us tonight, and good night.
Thank you. Are you going to email it to all of us who signed up for this one?
It's in Highline and it's on Yammer.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, I will look for that.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. Good night.
Good night. My pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you.